Hello, I'm Bo Weidema. This is the fourth video in a series of 10 on consequential modeling in lifecycle inventory analysis. The topic of this session is temporal issues in lifecycle assessment. So we'll deal with some of the typical temporal errors in lifecycle inventory. One is looking only at short-term changes and forgetting the long-term. Another is including the history of the product instead of the consequences of continued production and consumption. Except, of course, when the consequences are related to the product history. So when it matters what is in the product or where it comes from. The third issue is placing processes at the wrong places in time. So let's first look at short-term and long-term. Short-term is changes in capacity utilization only, and long-term is capacity changes. An example of a short-term change is the hourly changes in peak and base load impacts per kilowatt hours of current electricity consumption. An example of a capacity change is the impacts per kilowatt hour from the technology of the next power plant being built to satisfy the accumulated changes in peak and base load demand. Another example of a capacity utilization change in the short term is the increase in demand for an annual crop that leads to consumption changes, because there is no way that the farmer can produce more than he already planted. In the long term, of course, the farmer will increase his production next season. Now, long-term consequences last longer, and therefore they dominate the overall impacts. Now, consequences always go forwards in time. So if we look at a timeline where we have a vehicle and its use and maintenance, which is taking place more or less simultaneously, then we can ask ourselves, what is the consequences of buying and using this car for the fuel production, for the actual manufacture of the car? Intuitively, most people would place the fuel production before you're actually driving the car and the vehicle production before you're actually driving the car. And the infrastructure for vehicle production you would have before you actually start producing vehicles. But this is not consequences. This is looking historically at the picture. So this is an attributional approach to modeling. When we look at consequences, we have to think that when we buy a car, that car has already been produced. So the consequences of our buying it doesn't mean that it will be produced sometimes in history, because consequences don't go backwards in time. Instead, the consequence is that the signal we're sending by buying the car is that the producer says, oh, there is a demand for cars, so let's produce some more. So our demand has a consequence for the future, how many cars will be produced in the future and which kind of cars will be produced in the future. So actually, all of these activities take place forwards in time, from the decision to buy and use the car. Let's look at indirect land use change in consequential modeling. There is a lot of temporal aspects here. Again, we're dealing with an infrastructure. Indirect land use change is just the same as what the capacity of a steel factory is to steel production. It's the biomass production capacity of land to agriculture. So ILUC is simply the required supply of biomass production capacity, measured in productivity-weighted area time. So supplying the same amount of biomass. Historical changes are irrelevant. So what you often see in indirect land use modeling in attributional models is amortization of past land use change. While we are saying that changes happens forwards in time, and therefore our use of land right now induces future indirect land use change. So we model the changes that are induced by the current annual demand. We can distinguish different markets for that: arable, forest, rangeland. An increasing trend on the global market for arable land is met both by intensification of land already in use, about 40% of that total demand is met by intensification. The 60% is from transformation of land. Now let's look at the proportion between expansion and intensification when occupying arable land. From Faustat, we can see that over time there is an increase in the demand for products. There is an increase over time in output, and we can actually see how much of that increased production is caused by expansion of land area and how much is increased efficiency on the existing land. And the relationship here you can see is 63 to 37, analyzed from a period back 2000 to 2010. So that's where I had my roughly 40 and 60% from. Now, indirect land use change in consequential modeling looks at the land transformation effect of land occupation as a change in the general trend for forest cover. So we have a general deforestation trend currently. And what happens when we ask for more land is that this trend is slightly preponed. It happens earlier than it would have happened otherwise. But we're only asking for this land for 1 hectare year. So after that year, we'll actually release it again to somebody else to use. You could say we recycle the land area. And that means that we actually go back to the original decreasing line of the trend. So we just made a little bump in the curve. And that little bump is what we're responsible for. Now that little bump actually can have quite significant effects. This preponement of deforestation for the duration of the occupation has a GWP 100 effect that you can see in this slide here. We're moving from the red line to the blue line. So the area between the two graphs is actually the difference between those two is the additional CO2 concentration in the atmosphere over that total period where the pulse emission will remain in the atmosphere. And the differences between year 0 and year 1 is a difference of 0.00783 kilogram of CO2 equivalents. So this change from year 1 to year 0 has caused an additional CO2 equivalent of 0.00783. Now, forecasting is of course obvious when you're looking at things happening in the future. But when is forecasting actually needed? Well, basically when data from the recent past is not adequate. And when is that? Well, the question is, how bad a data quality can we live with? And that, of course, depends a lot on the specific study. What we have to look at is what time horizon is relevant. If we're talking about a demand in the current year that influences the investment decisions in the next 5 years, 10 years, or 10 to 15 years, of course, the whole shift in time depends a lot on the time it takes from you start taking a decision on building something and until that building is actually constructed. Now, we should actually have a time period that reflects the gap between the decision and the actual availability of that new capacity. The usual implied assumption on top of that is that the current identified marginal technology, for example, year 5 to 10 for electricity, does not influence what is identified as the marginal technology in later periods. So it's a one-time only thing that we are pushing things in time. Another aspect of time is the difference between static and dynamic models. Now, in standard LCA practice, we have yearly static models. That means that we, for example, have car production in year 1, then we have fuel use in years 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then finally we dispose of the car, let's say in year 11. Now, in a dynamic model, the decisions we're making today would influence the future model. So if we decide to buy our car in year 1, that actually may mean that there will be different models in year 2, and that again will influence how the demand for fuels, for example, will look like in year 3. So this kind of modeling is interesting, especially when you have large changes. Finally, there is the concept of equilibrium models. These are mainly modeling the effect of short-term price changes. Because the constraints in the markets, when we demand an additional amount of product, there will be a reduction in consumption because not all of the demand will come from the supply of the market. So this elasticity of supply, which is less than 1, means that we will have a lower impact of our consumption than if we just modeled a one-to-one relationship, so a unconstrained supply. Now, that means that this is very realistic for short-term constraints, but in the long term, there are fewer and fewer constraints, and therefore, as long as we say that the long-term impacts are more important than short-term impacts, then this effect is not of such big importance for a life cycle assessment. Some people have asked me, well, in consequential LCA, doesn't the consequences go on forever? Well, you could imagine that when you spend €1, then this euro goes on and will be then having consequences further along the life cycle. But for every time we move through an activity, there will be less of a euro left, because the rest of the euro leaks out as what we call wages, taxes, profit and rents, altogether called value added. So only a part of the revenue of an activity is spent on intermediate inputs that go further up the life cycle. And if you then imagine a life cycle, then there is the activity. If the activity is a life cycle, then there is no intermediate inputs anymore. That means that all the euro will eventually leak out as wages, taxes, profits, and rents. Without this leakage, consequences would go on forever, because the euro could then be spent again and again and again. But because of the leakage, consequences are fixed, or you could say consequences are not going on forever. You could say exactly the same for attribution of LCA, that without leakage, contributions would include everything since the beginning of history. But because of the leakage, that doesn't happen. So when we delimit the product life cycle, we tend to think that once you have spent the money and they've gone out to wages, we don't follow the consequences any further. So what we're modeling, you could say, is what corresponds to the first order effects of the original spending. So we're only including those activities that are reacting to the change in revenue, but we don't include what the consumer is doing with the money. But since we are including the first order effects, that means also that we are including the first order price rebound effects, because that is also a consequence of the spending. Because if we're spending less money on a product, we will have money left that we can spend on something else. This is called the rebound effect. But we don't include second order effects of education, research, and technology development, or changes that may result from the redistribution of the initial spending. So we could ask ourselves, why is that? Is that really reasonable? Shouldn't we also more systematically try to include second order effects while maintaining an unambiguous delimitation criteria? So how can we make a delimitation criteria that systematically includes the consequences of the leakage? Basically, what we can say is that leakage is an arbitrary cutoff. The argument that we've been using in earlier kind of argumentation for this cutoff here is that it's a separate decision. One decision is to spend the euro in the first place. Another decision is what people who earn the money are actually doing with the money in the next round. And we're only studying the decision from one decision to the next decision. But actually, if our first decision influences the second decision, then it remains an arbitrary cutoff to say this is where we stop. Basically, the traditional cutoff and saying we don't care about how people spend the money they earn is only valid if the consumption pattern is not influenced by the way the money from the first purchase is distributed. But we know that monetary redistribution does affect consumption patterns because the money will go to different people with different income levels and people with different income levels have different consumption patterns. So a more consistent modeling would include the consequences of monetary redistribution. So at an earlier course, I had a PhD student that took up this challenge and started to model what could we do to go beyond this normative system boundary. And looking at a case where we are having an income neutral effect or an expenditure neutral effect, moving our consumption from non-metal products to from the energy sector to non-metal products. Here a perturbation of 1,750 million US dollars, so $1.75 billion, moving from being spent on energy, instead being spent on non-metal products. Of course, in the first perturbation round, you will see some effects on the other sectors as well, because there is upstream to the non-metal products sector and upstreams to the energy sector, there is inputs that are affected. This goes again then on in the second and third and fourth and fifth and so on redistribution round. Now, the consequences of that for expenditures in the households depend on who receives the money. And because there is a different amount of low-skilled workers in the agricultural sector, you see there's much more low-skilled people in the agriculture sector than in the other sectors. And we'll see the high-skilled is mainly in services. So if we shift the consumption from agriculture to services, as you see here, or vice versa, then you will have a larger effect on the way the money is spent. Also because people with a low skill or low income will have less money saved. So there will be a larger saving if you give money to the high-skilled. So the effect on the low-skilled of this change here is actually that the low-skilled get more money, and the whole economy goes down because that means less investments. So over time, you will actually see a redistribution that in the beginning is negative in the sense of CO2 emissions as well, because the whole economy is breaking for a while because of this change, and then it's slowly recovering over time. But what remains as a consequence is that the distribution to the low-skilled people have increased. So the first round of redistribution dominates the effects and is non-negligible. It's about 2% of the total CO2 emissions that is caused by this next round. And the results reflect a permanent change, so a new steady state. So what you see here is an attempt to start thinking about how do we deal with economic modeling. So we're moving, you could say, LCA in the direction of being able to handle more advanced economic modeling, like we do with social accounting matrices, where we're adding more balanced conditions to our system. To the households, we add the balanced condition that consumption must equal income minus taxes minus savings. And to the financial flows, we say that investments must equal savings. And to the assets, we say that assets minus liability is the net worth of the individual actor. And in that way, we can start making much more advanced models of the flows and consequences of the economy. When you build an economic model, you look at temporal steps. You have opening assets and asset changes leading to closing assets. So we start looking not only at the flows in the economy, but also at the stock changes. So we're moving from accounting balances to behavioral rules that solve real-life imbalances between supply and demand. And here there are two kind of schools that have been developing different ways of dealing with economic models. The general equilibrium models from the neoclassical school and the stock flow consistent models from the post-Keynesian school. Now, these are different in the sense that general equilibrium models are driven by supply and optimization rationales, while the stock flow consistent models are driven by demand an agent's expectation. So that's more what you could call a procedural rationality. In general equilibrium models, the assumption is that there is no unemployment, while this is possible in a stock flow consistent model. In general equilibrium models, you have no inventories of goods, so you simply have prices that adjust until the markets are cleared, while in the stock flow consistent models, prices are set in advance and inventories then adjust to the prices. And finally, in general equilibrium models, money supply is exogenous, while in the stock flow consistent models, monies are supplied in proportion to investment demand and balanced by changes in household savings. So these two schools, which of course here is a bit squarely presented, are exchanging views, and I think we're getting to a place where there is getting more and more consensus about that they each have some advantages, and hopefully we get to a situation where the two schools are meeting to reflect reality as closely as possible. Now, you could say the stock flow consistent models are the ones that are closest to what we are doing currently in LCA. Namely, we have a demand-driven model, and we don't have any advanced ideas about what the prices should be in the sense of adjustments. We have an assumption that inventories can exist, and that stocks really are what we are using as a starting point for the next period. Why should we include economic modeling in LCA? Well, first of all, to account for these impacts from monetary redistribution, which we saw was non-negligible. And secondly, to include the distributional impacts of business cycles, which really matters for the total inequality in society. And also to model the physical consequences of economic policies. So this is really where our combined physical and economic models can be very, very interesting. So thanks for your attention, and this was the fourth video, 6 still to go.